Good afternoon and welcome to the first of 3 Safe Work Month webinars. Today's webinar, Think Psychological, Managing Psychosocial Hazards, will provide an opportunity to address questions related to the risk-based management of psychosocial hazards. The presentation will be presented by Bryce Ridgway from WorkSafe Mine Safety. Bryce is the Inspector of Mines, Mental Health and Wellbeing. Bryce will be joined by Justine McGilvray, Principal Inspector, Mental Health and Wellbeing from WorkSafe Petroleum Safety, and Annalise Proctor, Inspector Scientific Officer from WorkSafe General Industries. We acknowledge Aboriginal people as the traditional custodians of the lands on which we deliver our services. We pay our respects to elders and leaders, past, present and emerging. This webinar is being recorded. A link to the recording will be emailed to all registered participants. And just a reminder before we get started to go to slido.com to ask your questions. Event code for today is SWM1. We encourage you to ask your questions. I'll hand over to Bryce to get today's presentation underway.
Welcome to the first of our Safe Work Month webinars, which is on managing psychosocial hazards in the workplace. For some time, the consequences of exposure to psychosocial hazards like bullying, sexual harassment, stress and burnout have been well known. Those psychological health consequences well understood, and the benefits of taking a risk-based management approach to those psychosocial hazards and risk factors has been well known as well. More recently, however, with the commencement of the new Work Health Safety Act in WA, there have been some really good opportunities to look at psychosocial risk management in the context of our current legislative framework. Our new legislation, in fact, defines health to specifically include psychological health, which means those same duties and obligations that would apply to the management of physical hazards also apply to the management of psychosocial hazards. The Act itself establishes duties and obligations that apply to all PCBUs to identify and manage those hazards. Our regulations create additional obligations and provide further duties that apply to PCBUs broadly across industries. Now, we have 3 regulations that apply to industries, including general industries, mining operations and petroleum operations in WA. The obligations under each of these regulations is slightly different, so it is really important that PCBUs are aware of what those obligations are specific to their industry focus. Now, below our legislative framework sits our codes of practice, and we have 4 psychosocial codes available that have been gazetted under the Work Health Safety Act. The first of these codes is our Psychosocial Hazards in the Workplace Code of Practice. This code of practice looks at psychosocial hazards and risk factors broadly and provides a really good foundation in terms of establishing minimum compliance standards as they apply to the management of psychosocial hazards in the workplace. Really importantly, this code of practice establishes a risk-based framework which can be used to assist duty holders to meet their obligations in relation to how they actually address psychosocial hazards that are relevant to their workplaces. Now, further to that code of practice, we have several other codes that apply to specific hazard categories, such as the Workplace Behaviour Code of Practice and the Workplace Violence and Aggression Code of Practice. We also have a code which looks at mentally healthy workplaces in FIFO industries that considers that system of work specifically and some of the psychosocial considerations that relate to that system of work, particularly in terms of mining and construction. Now, below our codes of practice, DMIRS also regularly releases guidance and information products that are, again, there to assist duty holders to actually meet their obligations in terms of the management of psychosocial hazard. A good example of this are our gendered violence information sheets, which went out in the last few months and look at specific psychosocial hazards in terms of sexual assault and sexual harassment, and in the case of mining operations, legislative requirements that relate to the notification of gendered violence incidents in mining operations. Really importantly, all of these resources are readily available through our DMIRS website and specifically the Mentally Healthy Workplaces online hub. So you can access those resources, and we're regularly adding new information resources there as well. Just as a reminder before we go to the webinar, if you do have any questions, please post them via Slido. You can enter the event code and then post your question for us to respond to. If you do want to, there are different ways to connect with DMIRS and with WorkSafe as well, including through social media and also via the subscription page on our website. And final reminder, therefore, the details to actually go to Slido and to register your questions for our panel to respond to. And just as a final reminder as well, this is the first of 3 webinars that will be broadcast through Safe Work Month. And there are another couple coming up there which also look at incident notification and regulating work health and safety coming up later in the month. And now we'll go to the presentation, the questions.
Thanks, Bryce. So I think to get us started, a great question that has come in is, has the introduction of the Work Health and Safety Act changed the risk management approach to psychosocial health?
Look, it has to a certain extent. There have obviously always been obligations under our previous legislation as well, which required that duty holders, employers, made sure that they were identifying and managing hazards, establishing controls, whether those hazards were psychosocial or physical hazards. The benefit we have with our new legislation is obviously that health is defined specifically to include psychological health. So it makes it really, really clear that the expectation is that where there are psychosocial hazards that could impact on psychological health in a workplace, then they need to be addressed the same way that you would address physical hazards as well.
Great. Annalise, did you have anything to add?
No, I think Bryce covered it all.
So Annalise, I might hand this over to you. What is, as far as reasonably practicable when caring for workers' mental health that is outside of work and impacting work functions?
Well, that's a very good question. Just as a start, I guess, did you have anything to add, Justine, to that question?
I think it's important to establish the work-related connection. So if it is a work function and there's a work-related connection to the mental health, then certainly that's something that employers or PCBUs need to consider.
Is that something that we would be looking at policy and procedure wise and kind of in the workplace, or is that kind of just a, I guess, an accepted how to act in a workplace function?
I think it's certainly practicable for employers to be looking at their policies and procedures in relation to that. And if there are work-related events, Justine was saying, then it would make sense that you would have some policy coverage in terms of what might be acceptable or inappropriate in those contexts as well, and particularly where that might link back to a code of conduct, for example, that an organisation already has established. So would certainly think so.
And so, that's great. Things that think of immediately is fitness for work policies in terms of how people manage fitness for work, whether it's related to mental health, whether it's related to fatigue or other issues, is important. And it's good to have those policies in place so that there is a system to manage that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Bryce, how do you think remote work environments influence psychological safety?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Obviously, we have our FIFO Mentally Healthy Workplaces Code of Practice, which addresses some of those considerations as well. Remote work can impact in a number of ways. There are specific psychosocial risk factors that look at very remote work, and then the influence that remote work might have on in terms of people's access to supervision and management, whether that might actually impact on people's ability to access certain support services as well. And that's specific to psychosocial risk, obviously, but then there are other considerations in terms of remote work as well, like people's access to their support systems, their support structures as well, which whilst not necessarily a psychosocial risk factor in and of itself, is certainly something that will be protective for people. So considerations that can be addressed within those remote work arrangements. Within a mining context, there's obviously been a lot of work and a lot of information published in relation to how some of those considerations can actually be addressed and what sort of practicable controls can be established as well around addressing some of the risks that might go along with remote work that could impact on psychological health. So yeah, mining is certainly a pretty important source of information there, but certainly in your area as well, Justine, there are considerations that are relevant too.
Absolutely, especially as you said, it's the remote nature of the work and the isolation and the ability to access your support networks is so critical. The other thing I just wanted to mention is when we talk about psychological safety here in this context, we're talking about psychosocial hazards, not the other term psychological safety, which refers to the shared belief of people feeling they're able to have a voice, report concerns without any fear of negative consequences. So it's really important to distinguish between those different concepts that often come up as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if, as an example, I suppose practical consideration in terms of your remote work, if you do have small work teams, particularly working remotely, where they do have that lack of access to supervision management, then that can certainly impact on things like people's access to reporting systems. So where you're looking at what some of the practical considerations for small remote work groups, you might be considering, well, how do we ensure that we're addressing cultural issues as well that might actually act as barriers to people reporting, seeking access to internal support systems, those sorts of things too.
Yeah. And I guess a good question has come in along reporting, and I'll just hand this out to anyone who wants to answer. How to comply with the need to report immediately or as soon as possible when allegations are not yet investigated or substantiated? Could this possibly lead to over-reporting?
I think obviously the best answer is that we're not against over-reporting, that, you know, we're happy to always provide information to the public, to the businesses, to the PCBUs about their responsibilities. Moving forward, I guess, in terms of reporting those immediate incidences, obviously, you know, yes, give us a call, have a chat to the call centre. If it's something that isn't needing immediate attention, then it can be put through our website online. And then a inspector can give you a call back to discuss that one further.
Absolutely.
And obviously more mining, I guess, anything else you want to add that way?
Yeah, and I think just probably adding to that as well, we look at certain hazard types like sexual harassment, for example. We know that when a report comes into an employer, it can be really difficult to substantiate, particularly if there's a lack of witnesses, if it is the complainant making a complaint and only the respondent there who's actually able to provide further information around it as well. So if we consider that, we know that that's a risk. Relying on whether or not an incident can be substantiated can actually mean that we're under-reporting rather than over-reporting. So if something is serious in terms of an incident that's been reported, as Annalise is saying, we'd always encourage PCBUs, mine operators in our case as well, to make sure that those incidents are being notified as immediately or as soon as practicable. So that we can then follow alongside with some of those internal investigation processes as well, whilst work is being done to substantiate from a human resources perspective, but at the same time also be looking at how a PCBU, how a business might actually be looking at the work-related risk factors associated with that incident, whether it's substantiated or not, so that they can ensure that the controls they have in place are adequate and they would prevent those sort of incidents from occurring, as I say, whether an incident might be substantiated or not.
That's a good point. And under the PGO regulations, the Petroleum and Geothermal Energy Operations Regulations, there is a section that says that any incident that a reasonable operator would investigate should be reported to the regulator. So if it requires investigation or if it's going to be investigated, you should just report it. Okay, great. Got lots of questions coming in. It's really great. So this is a great question. The psychologically safe risk assessment identifies change as a risk factor. Can you please elaborate on systems that WorkSafe recommends for this issue? How do we manage the risk of change?
So I guess a great resource that we recommend or we look at is the People at Work. I think that's a great way of assessing your employees in terms of psychosocial hazards where they see issues with workflow, issue with changes in the workplace. I think if you're having an authentic conversation with your employees and giving them the scope to come back with feedback, that's a great way to at least identify those hazards and then start to put towards policies and procedures around them. I guess, is there anything else?
Well, we know a structured change management process certainly helps. So having a management system that outlines how change can be integrated into a workplace, which involves consultation with workers, certainly does reduce the risk. It's more the unstructured change that creates the higher risk.
And Yeah, so certainly, I mean, there are legislative obligations around communication consultation on where change might impact the way work is done or whether it might introduce new risks or hazards into a workplace or an operation as well. So there are those really important considerations that are pretty key in terms of managing or establishing controls around change. Also would say that there are really good opportunities through coaching, training, information processes to make sure that leaders at every level in an organisation are actually well versed in how to communicate change and how to address change with their teams as well. And obviously making sure that for employees and workers that they understand what a change process might actually entail, what the likely impacts of it are, and make sure that there are open lines of communication around those as well.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. Another one, couple are related, so I'll just start with one. Why are topics like bullying, for example, being targeted under work health and safety avenues instead of HR or fair work avenues?
It's a very good question. I feel like that might be a prize question.
I'm happy to jump in on that one.
Yeah.
So I think the reality of it is the reason why we're looking at it in a work health and safety context is because they're health and safety issues. So we know that exposure to bullying, for example, I think that was one of the hazards that was identified there. Exposure to bullying can have effects on people's psychological health. So it does need to be addressed as a work health and safety issue because there are work-related factors that are involved there, and it's a foreseeable hazard that people may behave inappropriately towards each other, and there are practicable controls that can be established that might either eliminate or make those sorts of behaviours less likely in the workplace as well. And that doesn't take away from the fact that there are still HR considerations in terms of those things, and there are still there's still coverage in other pieces of legislation like the Fair Work Act as well.
Yeah. And when you look at the definition of a hazard, it's anything in the workplace that may cause or have a risk of harm to health. And we know bullying creates a risk to harm to health. It's well established, as well as the other psychosocial hazards.
Absolutely.
So along those lines, because performance management is often integrated or associated with workplace bullying, when can managing performance of an employee be seen as creating psychological harm? What do you think along those lines?
I guess with performance management, because it can be felt, by the employee that it is bullying, as long as it's a appropriate, guided performance management that's by the company's policies and procedures, we can understand that sometimes conversations around performance to employees can feel targeted, can I guess induce feelings of anxiety or worry around their position, and I guess looking towards that job clarity may cause psychosocial hazard in itself that may lead to further impacts on the position as well in terms of your day-to-day job. Anything else you think of, Justine?
I'm just reflecting on some of the inspections I've done, and it certainly has involved performance management along with the different types of behaviours. So for me, bullying involves a number of different types of behaviour. It's usually not just one type of behaviour. And the line that I tend to draw on is harsh and unreasonable. So when it's harsh and unreasonable performance management, that's when we might start to consider it could be a bullying type behaviour.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess inappropriate use of performance management too as well. That makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. This is a great question. I haven't done this training myself, but if anyone else has, please jump in. Do you encourage mental health first aid training?
I haven't done it either. I think it's definitely a big topic these days, and I think anything that workplaces or individuals are doing to understand mental health and to understand how they can support their colleagues or support their employees in a business, I think is a great thing. I do think that obviously it's such an emerging topic, and you can see the world is asking to understand what psychological health is and how it impacts.
Yeah, and look, I think in the context of work health safety obligations particularly, what we would encourage is taking a risk-based approach. So in terms of any training initiative that you're looking at or any program, how does that actually fit as part of your system of controls? And how does it specifically address psychosocial hazards and risk factors that might emerge in a particular workplace? Certainly part of the message that we have been communicating over the last few years now is really around ensuring that the controls that we're establishing, the actions that we're taking, focus on the development and maintenance of a mentally healthy workplace, rather than addressing issues that might focus on mental health at work. So really considering, well, what's within the control of a PCBU, what is practicable to address the work-related issues, rather than trying to be a real catch-all around work and mental health as well. That's really what's reinforced through
So
that
prevention rather than
approach.
treatment kind of thing. You know?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Any controls or initiatives should be targeted at the source of the risk. So if it is about a low level awareness or training or information, then certainly that could be of use. But our first point of call is trying to eliminate that risk and then minimise the risk through other additional controls like training and information.
Yeah, and there's an important consideration there as well. If through your risk assessment process, you're identifying that mental health first aid might be it might be an important consideration in that system of controls, then also identifying so who needs it? Who do we actually want to target with that training to ensure that the right people are getting it so that it can be an effective control within your system of controls as well?
Yep. Okay. Can you talk through what a psychosocial risk assessment should look like, for example, at a team level by a supervisor compared to at an organisational level where you have a large number of workers?
I guess on a team level, it's that the team leader having, like I said, that authentic, open conversation with their direct reports, letting them have the ability to identify any areas where they feel that a hazard could arise from. I guess, looking at systems of work, is there a better way to, look at breaks, to look at managing fatigue, to look at all of that, all of the whole, almost the whole sphere of their work, and giving them the opportunity to feel heard, and then that team leader then relaying that up to upper management to then look at the organisational controls, which
Yeah, look,
you, Bryce, sorry.
and the processes for the risk assessment of physical hazards aren't really any different to the processes associated or the process associated with the identification of psychosocial hazards and the establishment of controls, the design of controls to suit it. So again, if we're looking at it from that risk-based approach, it is about ensuring there are systems in place at a higher level and at a team-focused level as well to identify hazards, to ensure that effective controls are actually established, and if there aren't existing controls, to make sure that effective controls are designed and implemented, to ensure that we're actually monitoring the efficacy of those controls as well, and then we're using that as a feedback loop into that system of control, and that can obviously occur at a team level, but it can occur at a higher level as well.
Absolutely.
And I think one of the main or key points that both you have mentioned is consultation with the workforce or workers is really important as part of that.
Yeah.
They know what's causing them harm or likely to cause them harm, and usually they're a really good source of how to fix it as well. So definitely consultation is one of the key steps in the risk assessment process.
Yeah, and probably just the other thing that I would add there as well, Justine, is through that consultation process, ensuring that we're consulting broadly, knowing that the hazard and risk factors that are relevant for one team in a business or an organisation may not be as relevant for others, and there may be different considerations across teams or work groups or work environments as well.
And that's what I was going to say as well. I guess a system to use as well could be questionnaires, kind of anonymous questionnaires as well, looking at, like you said, the different departments, and the ability that maybe you don't want to speak to your team leader directly about this hazard, and can you report that anonymously, collecting that data that way as well.
Great, so we've got heaps of great questions coming in. Please keep sending them through, and we'll try and get through as many questions as we can with the remaining time that we have. Okay. So along those lines, Annalise, actually you were saying about having anonymous reporting systems. How can you support people when they feel like they can't talk to management or they won't be heard or taken seriously?
So I do think you know, quite often, you know, maybe you do have a grievance with the manager you report to, which is obviously, you know, where your complaint would go. And it is having that ability to report anonymously through some form of reporting system. I think it needs to be almost championed at every single meeting, that, you know, there isn't that fear of retribution. You know, your complaint, how big, how small, whatever it is, will be heard, will be dealt with, you know, kind of by a third party that's got no kind of invested interest in the outcome, and that you feel confident that your complaint, whether it's formal or informal, will be dealt with appropriately. I guess that confidence in management, which is key, like you said about the training, that managers need to be aware of appropriate conversations and, you know, when to escalate.
Yeah.
Yeah, agree, absolutely. I think having those multiple pathways for reporting are really important.
Absolutely.
And also then being able to demonstrate culturally that when we receive a report, we do take it quite seriously. So ensuring that all leaders and people who might be handling reports are well trained in the processes for following up those reports, ensuring that every report is actually investigated as well, and ensuring that, allowing for confidentiality and anonymity, obviously, that learnings or key findings from psychosocial incident investigations are actually shared within an organisation as well, and that the changes that might come out of come into your system of controls as a result of investigations are actually communicated to the organisation as well. I think that goes a long way to establishing trust in the reporting process and making it more likely people will report.
Great. Another reporting question. This one is for when you report to DMIRS. So how can people manage trauma-informed principles or trauma-informed care principles when they do report information to DMIRS on potentially traumatic incidents that might have occurred? What recommendations would you suggest?
So I guess in terms of trauma informed, the recommendation is that you don't want to expose the affected person to, you know, repeating their story over and over again. I do think when it is reported to our call centre or through online, that it's best to give as much information as reasonably possible to give our inspectors the scope to then assess. Obviously, we, you know, don't always talk to the affected person. Sometimes we do, sometimes they come forward in their own instance. Sometimes it is reported before by the PCBU. I think it's important for PCBUs to understand that the support that person might need, kind of, you know, ongoing. Yeah, it's a bit of a process, I guess. It's not one size fits all situation.
Yeah, and I think, as you're saying, Annalise, there are those considerations that relate directly to how an employer or a PCBU might respond internally, how they might be providing support in the context of information that's reported to DMIRS. So if we consider examples of high potential incidents like gendered violence, we obviously do encourage PCBUs to report that information as soon as they can. They can do it through our call centre, obviously, and certainly for mining operations, there are online processes there through SRS as well. And we appreciate that at times it may be beneficial to actually provide limited information and certainly non-identifying information through our information systems. Then what we will typically do when we follow it up and we make inquiries is work directly with the senior managers who are actually reporting the incidents to us. And be quite sensitive, quite respectful to the effect of our inquiries on a victim or a complainant as well. Take that into account in terms of how we actually make our inquiries, and often make requests for contact with a victim rather than requiring them to speak with
absolutely.
us.
Yeah.
So it's those sorts of considerations, and working through their employer or other people who they may feel more comfortable with as well. So yeah, changing the way that we might actually make inquiries there to be sensitive to what a victim or an affected person actually might need.
Absolutely, yeah.
Great. So along those lines, there is a significant focus at the moment on gendered violence, particularly in the workplace. What can PCBUs do to manage or meet their obligations under the Act to manage the risk of gendered violence?
Yeah. Did you want to dive in first, Annalise?
Probably let you go first, and then I can put it to the general industry sphere as well after. Yeah.
Perfect. So I think broadly the first consideration would be actually doing the risk assessment. So actually understanding, well, what are the foreseeable risks in relation to gendered violence in terms of a particular operation or a particular business, knowing that the nature of the work performed, the nature of the work environment itself can obviously contribute to the likelihood of some of those hazards actually occurring or people being exposed to those hazards. So having an effective risk assessment and a robust risk assessment that does meet the needs around consultation, broad consultation with the workforce as well is really important there. And certainly engaging subject matter expertise in relation to that as well. So if it is a higher risk environment, certainly understanding who might be able to contribute to that risk assessment process through contributing technical expertise and knowledge. And certainly then understanding what are the practical controls that can be implemented, focusing first on obviously eliminating a hazard, and then looking at, well, what are the preventative controls that we might be able to establish as well that would significantly reduce the likelihood of a hazard exposure occurring, prior to considering, well, what other controls that we might need to implement if someone actually is exposed to a hazard or if there is harm to health as well. So following through that process quite broadly is certainly a really important first step in meeting obligations. Annalise, did you want to add to that as well?
I was going to say pretty much exactly that. I think from my general industries experience is that because I deal from everyone from the mum and dad cafes up to the larger businesses, it is that kind of the scope of understanding or the scope of resource that whichever PCBU has, which I think these resources in terms of all of our codes of practice around, psychosocial hazards, workplace behaviours are a great resource for people to start and kind of then looking, like you said, looking at what possible kinds of risk hazards could be in that area and kind of working back, because obviously it's varied, very much so. Yeah,
absolutely. And I suppose talking to that specifically in terms of the codes of practice as well, if through that risk assessment process there's an identification of potential internal sources of hazard exposures, then the Workplace Behaviours Code of Practice is a really good source of information. If there are external sources of risk in relation to gendered violence, so external to the organisation, then looking at the Workplace Violence and Aggression Code is again a really good source of information. And there are also gendered violence information sheets which go into more specific and practical detail as well. But certainly if you're looking broadly at those obligations under the work health safety legislation, it does start with that risk assessment process and identification of hazards, with the codes of practice then providing that really practical information around what do you actually need to do to meet those minimum standards as well.
I think that's a good point, especially when you're talking about the different scale of businesses that are in WA. We have very small to medium-sized businesses to very large, and the risk factors associated with gendered violence may be different if you're in a smaller to larger organisation. So the risk assessment process is critical to understanding what risk factors you might have in your actual specific workplace, so you can target and eliminate or reduce those sort of risk factors, because you can't, one size does not fit all.
No. And I think the other thing that's probably helpful to highlight there is considering how some of those risk factors will actually interact as well. So if we're looking at, say, remote sites where there is less ready access to supervision, but there is also the use or the supply of alcohol, for example, when we start to see some of those factors interacting, then that might actually increase risk. So understanding those dynamics and then looking at the controls that are required to address them as well.
So speaking of controls, there is a requirement in the legislation to monitor the effectiveness of controls for hazards in general. Does this apply to psychosocial hazards, and how would a PCBU do this?
So definitely applies to psychosocial hazards. Again, I guess the best way is to be constantly reviewing your policies and procedures and controls, ensuring that they are controlling the hazard as best possible outcome kind of area, and also that consultation. Consultation with your employees, consultation in management meetings. Is this impacting business in a way that is a negative effect on the business that might be causing more psychosocial hazards, in terms of pressure on employees to do things a different way, this way. I think, as long as that consultation, as long as that understanding that the procedure is and it is working, basically, is a great place to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, depending on the nature of the business and the scope of work involved, there will typically be lots and lots of data sources that you can actually use to monitor the effectiveness of those controls as well. And some of them really broadly through that consultation process, for example, might be around workforce or employee surveys, those sorts of which are more formal processes. You can certainly review your incident information though as well and your psychosocial hazard reports. You can certainly consider the outcomes of investigations as well and ensure that every time an incident is reported, it's being really thoroughly investigated. And as part of that investigation, that system of controls is actually being reviewed actively as well. And there are lots more sources of data that you could obviously draw on through an organisation as well. Justine, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I'm just thinking there's a lot of triggers that might help when you consider when it's important to review whether or not your controls are still effective too.
Yeah.
So if there is an incident or alleged incident, that could be a trigger to go back and look at your controls. Whether you might do an annual survey and see that there's a decline in I guess overall mental health of what people are reporting, that could also trigger you to look at, well, our controls still effective.
Yeah.
So generally it's good to monitor your effectiveness regularly and check in with the people that are potentially affected as well and see whether or not they do think it's being managed effectively. So
Absolutely.
if there's risk specific to a team, consult with the workers of that team. If it's a broader control for the whole organisation, you might look at other broader data sources, as Bryce said. So there's many different triggers and data, a lot of data you can collect, even if you don't formally collect it as part of your HR systems. I think that's probably the first step, is looking at what do you have already available that could tell you whether they're effective or not.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll take an opportunity to highlight there, which is slightly off the general question, but I think it's really important to just reinforce around the new legislation as well, is that where there are incidents that are notifiable to WorkSafe, and in the context of mining operations reportable, that is actually a trigger point. There's a legislative requirement that you must review your controls in relation to that hazard, and that includes psychosocial hazards as well.
Absolutely. And we'd hope that in general industries as well, that if it was, yeah.
Okay. So since we're on the topic of controls and reporting still, I might just ask this question that has been here for a little while, so hopefully you're still around. Are mental health issues like burnout or fatigue considered an LTI, so lost time injury, or notifiable incident when employees miss more than a specific consecutive number of days?
So I guess in terms of the psychosocial hazard reporting, if an employee can't complete their, I guess, the hired position for more than 10 consecutive days, and they're unable to complete other work in the interim, that would be something we consider a reportable injury to us. In terms of LTI, I might have to get you to fill in the gaps there, a bit outside of my sphere. But definitely fatigue, burnout, all of those can be attributed to psychosocial hazard in terms of maybe bad systems of work, inadequate break times, inadequate times to rest and recuperate.
Yeah, look,
sorry.
absolutely agree, Annalise. So if any incident, if any work-related incident results in someone being unable to perform their duties, or a general practitioner would believe that they're unable to perform their duties for 10 days, or minimum of 10 days, then that would be reportable. The legislation doesn't necessarily use language around LTIs, but it is that really clear definition in terms of what is an injury and a notifiable incident as a result of that.
That's right, and I think the important thing is there, a medical practitioner is the one that makes that call, that they're not able to perform their full duties for 10 days or more, or likely to not able to perform those duties, so then it would be notifiable.
Yeah.
Okay, what training and experience do you think HR or human resources need in terms of psychosocial hazards and risk management for work health and safety? Because we know that the systems often overlap or integrate. HR, we've got workers' comp, we've got work health and safety, and the topics we are talking about in terms of psychosocial hazards can fall in all those realms.
Absolutely can. Yeah. That's you, Bryce.
I can jump in that one. Yeah, absolutely. So there's certainly nothing prescriptive in the legislation that deals with how an organisation, how a business must address psychosocial issues and who must be involved in that. But certainly there's going to be a lot of overlap, as you say, Justine, between your typical psychosocial hazards and the human resource function in a lot of businesses. So I think from a systems perspective, really, really important that HR functions, HR business functions and health and safety business functions are well integrated. So there is a ready flow of information between the two. There are processes actually established to make sure that both of those groups will be involved where there is a report of a psychosocial hazard. And then, so in terms of what training or what development might be helpful for HR practitioners in that field, again, nothing prescriptive, but probably what's helpful to consider is informational training that's going to help HR practitioners really understand the nature and drivers of these different psychosocial hazards, actually be able to identify how they might be relevant for different work groups as well, and being really clear on what the consequence of exposure to a psychosocial hazard or a psychosocial risk factor might actually be as well, so that again, if it's through involvement in that risk assessment process, they can be quite clear, quite thorough in terms of identifying proactively what might be the issues that need to be addressed. If it's more reactive, so in response to reports of psychosocial hazards, for example, again, being really, really clear on what the associated risk factors are, so that they can actually be identified through that investigation process. And then those HR practitioners can be contributing to that review of controls and what we should be doing differently to prevent those sorts of incidents from recurring as well.
And that's a good point in terms of incidents that reported. Generally, we know people work within a system, and so the recommendations should be aimed at a system level to start with, then team level, then individual, because we're really looking at eliminating the risks overall at the workplace, and it's not generally specific to individuals, even though they may have been the ones to experience the harm to health. So it's about considering, well, how do these risks present across the workplace or across the team, and what we can do to reduce that through the hierarchy of control.
We had the question earlier around substantiating whether incidents have occurred or not, and there's probably, again, there's relevance there in that question where an HR function within a business will often be looking to substantiate whether an incident did occur, because there might be action that needs to be taken in relation to that. But there's also a really important need to identify the work-related factors, the work environment factors, the organisational risk factors that might be contributing to an incident, whether or not it can be substantiated. So it's important for HR personnel to be able to look at it from both perspectives.
Thank you. Got some good questions coming in. We've got 15 minutes left, so please keep sending the questions in. So, Annalise, maybe you could provide some further information on what WorkSafe would expect to see or read when looking at policies around psychological health or psychosocial hazards and risk management.
So I guess in terms of what I'd expect if I was going out to an inspection would be straight up code of conduct, looking at the code of conduct to be very thorough in kind of identifying areas that may need controls in place, and also the fact that all employees are aware and have direct access to code of conduct, any policies, procedures around that could be, I guess, a psychosocial hazard in themselves, any areas of work, like you said, any specific groups that could be exposed more so than another group. Yes, I might pass that on to you as well, Bryce.
Yeah, I agree absolutely with everything you said. And then I suppose there's a couple of things to add potentially as well. Would have an expectation that policies would align with the identified psychosocial hazards as well, and that they would be quite comprehensive in terms of addressing those identified hazards, and that there's evidence that there has been some consultation in the development of those policies and procedures as well. So evidence that workers have been able to input, whether that's workers broadly or whether that's health and safety representatives particularly. And also then if there are updates or changes made to those policies, again, that there's an opportunity for consultation, feedback and input from the workforce as well.
Yeah, and it's really important that leaders and managers are across those policies, aware what's in them, and that they are enacting them. They provide sufficient resources and time for whatever's in those policies and leadership commitment to be carried out in the workplace, so that they're not just a piece of paper or a document sitting on someone's desk. They're actually something that happens in the workplace as well.
And I think it aligns with what both of you have said. When we go out and we do inspections on sites, of course we expect to see policies, but then we also expect to be able to go out and talk with any worker in that business or that organisation, and for them to be able to tell us what's in those policies as well at an appropriate level, and to understand what the implications of those policies and procedures are for them in terms of that system of psychosocial controls as well.
So great question here, and it's very pertinent at the times when we have COVID and people are not well, or we've got an issue of understaffing or under-resourcing in a lot of industries.
Yeah.
What are employers or PCBU's responsibilities in terms of managing understaffing that may lead to work-related stress?
I guess in terms of understaffing, like you said, it's a global problem at the moment. I guess a lot of people are empathetic to the PCBU's dilemma, and a lot of staff are happy to do those extra shifts, help out the business. I guess it's an understanding between the PCBU and the employee about where their hard point is in terms of, I can do these extra shifts, but at this point, I'm starting to feel tired, I'm starting to feel overwhelmed, and almost creating procedures, I guess, around that kind of this weird time of the world, in terms of maybe it's not your standard policy and procedure around fatigue management, but it's a slightly edited version to help out, to give employees that confidence in, yes, I'm helping, but I'm not going to be overstretched. Sorry.
Yeah, and look, we've just talked to the point, isn't it? It's a foreseeable risk.
Yeah.
So we understand through COVID particularly, but for other reasons as well, there can be staffing and personnel shortages, and some of those can be short notice and can be difficult to adjust to, but it is still a foreseeable risk. So there is that need to have systems in place, processes in place that mean that if that does become an issue, the organisation does have a way of addressing it as well, so that it won't have that negative impact on psychological health of workers.
Absolutely.
And it's a tricky one to answer because there isn't a one-size-fits-all situational answer for this, because there's different industries, different jobs. Some are client-facing, some are not. But it's really about, I think, consultation with the workers as well, seeing where you can modify the resources or the distribution of work at that time if you don't have enough staff. So there's a lot of practical things I think a manager can do at their level in terms of how they control and manage the workload of their teams to get through that time as well.
Yeah, and ensuring that there's good support for management personnel to do that, so that they have the information, they have the delegated authority to make those decisions where they need to as well, so they can feel confident in making those adjustments that are intended to benefit their workers' psychological health.
So if a person reports an incident and they have specifically requested that no further action is taken, what are the PCBU's responsibilities?
Did you want me to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I was going to say it's a bit of a hard
Bernadette?
question, isn't it? Because it's
it can be really challenging, I'd say at minimum, if a report is coming through that an incident has occurred. In terms of a psychosocial hazard, there can still be an investigation process that goes on there. So an individual may not want a formal investigation process to occur addressing the other individual or involving the respondent, but that doesn't mean an organisation still can't take steps to look at their system of controls, review their controls, understand whether there are any work or organisational risk factors that might be able to be addressed differently that would prevent those sorts of incidents from recurring in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. They might look at it more of a team or organisational level, and what are the risk factors that may be present that's creating this issue, rather than it being about the individuals involved or concerning in the report. So I think if it is something where you can identify, well, what risk factors are in play, there are obligations to manage those risks towards all employees, not just the ones that have reported these issues.
Yeah, and I think even if an employee or any person for that matter is raising concerns in a workplace about their exposure to psychosocial hazards, really important to ensure that that person is receiving the support that they actually need as well, in addition to the investigations that might be undertaken.
It is that constant learning, isn't it? Any incident is something that we can learn from and improve systems. So, yeah.
Okay. Another interesting one, and particularly relevant, is in terms of social media from customers or external sources, which may have an impact on mental health for workers. How far does an employer or PCBU have to go to manage the risk?
That is an interesting question, isn't it?
And
Yeah.
the standard will be consistent. So it will be, well, what is reasonably practicable, or what actions are reasonably practicable for a employer or PCBU to actually take in relation to that. So again, if there are foreseeable risks there, and maybe that's associated with external sources of risk and information that's being posted on social media that employees are actually being exposed to, that may be of a harassing nature or maybe of an aggressive or threatening nature, for example, then using those codes of practice. So looking at the Workplace Violence and Aggression Code of Practice, understanding what some of the practicable controls and the system for assessing the risks associated with those hazards actually are, and then implementing those. And again, I would say that's a key area where consultation is actually going to be really important.
Absolutely, having conversation with the employees about how it's affecting them. Is it anything that they can foresee that could mitigate that psychosocial hazard? Unfortunately, reviews these days are a big thing, especially social media.
And again, whilst we'd always focus on preventative controls in the first instance and trying to prevent workers from being exposed to those hazards in the first instance, really important to consider, if it is foreseeable that there will be a hazard exposure, then what do we actually need to have in place to ensure that workers have what they need, the support that they need, to make sure that we're either preventing harm to health that might occur, or if there is some harm to health, that they're actually supported to mitigate that harm and to recover and return to work if it's at the more serious end as well.
Right, we have a few minutes left, so we probably have a time for a couple more questions. I know there is more here, but we'll try and
Is this our lightning round, Justine? With short answers?
Yes. Short answers. There's a few that we've already touched on, so I won't ask them again, but this is one, and it's quite a common question we often get asked as inspectors. How do we protect the mental health of those who have been accused or are the respondent when the allegations have not been substantiated or are yet to be, especially when there is an obligation to report to the regulator?
Probably more mine side.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that one as well. So I think, again, we've talked to the requirement for those established procedures and systems, and this is really key. So ensuring that if there is going to be an investigation or a follow-up process, that the respondent actually understands what that will look like, that process is applied fairly and consistently across all circumstances, and that they're kept informed through that process as well. And to certainly where an incident is reported to Mine Safety and we follow up and investigate, we'll try and make it really clear what our focus is in terms of the investigation, try and make sure that we're establishing or clearly communicating around what our processes are and what that process will actually look like as well. So I think from the external reporting perspective, reporting to DMIRS, that's an important consideration in terms of our follow-up, but then back on that internal focus, so how a company can actually respond, again, ensuring that there are supports in place or supports accessible to everyone who might actually be involved in that incident investigation process as well.
That organisational justice, applying everything fairly. I think that's same for general industries, that it would be recommended that, you're supporting both parties, being very clear, concise in your dialogue, the progress of the investigation, and it is that clarity, isn't it? For the PCBU to be giving to the employees, and I guess that support, I guess, is key as well for both parties.
Okay. At what point does a mental health issue become a notifiable injury?
In terms of a notifiable injury, if it actually meets the specific requirements of the legislation. So it meets the definition of a serious injury. And we highlighted this, probably the key one in most workplaces is going to be that injury results in someone or a medical practitioner declaring that someone won't be able to perform their normal duties for those 10 days. So if it is a work-related incident and that is an outcome, then that's when it will be a notifiable incident. as well. And there are some other considerations there as well. So for mining operations, for example, there will be requirements for reportable incidents where an incident occurs and perhaps no injury follows it, but that incident, that psychosocial incident, had the potential to cause serious harm to an individual. So in that instance, it would also be reportable through to WorkSafe Mine Safety.
And so there is a comment here that there is a concern that people will not report events of a sensitive nature because it's mandatory to report to a third party, such as WorkSafe. Do you have any comments on that, Annalise or Bryce?
I think understanding that WorkSafe always has that, I guess, confidentiality in mind in all aspects of our investigations. I think the ability to report to that third party if you feel that the internal processes at your company, haven't in your minds been adequate or appropriate, then I think it is that good fallback to have the ability to report to us. I do understand that people might feel, in terms of the PCBU not reporting injuries, to then avoid talking to WorkSafe, but I think in the long run, it benefits the company. It benefits them in terms of changing the organisational structure, improving systems of work, preventing future incidents and injuries. So it's a bit of I get it. It's a double-edged sword, but it's always working towards improving systems of work.
Yeah, and I think meeting those reporting obligations is a really good way for an organisation to demonstrate that they take their workers' psychological health very seriously.
Building that trust.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So we have time for one last question. Are mental health first aiders, or perhaps any type of specific role like health and safety reps, required to raise incidents if they are concerned about someone who has spoken to them?
I can handle that one.
Do you want me to jump in on that one?
Handle that one.
So,
Good one to finish on.
It is.
Absolutely. So within the legislation, there's not a requirement for specific identified individuals like mental health first aiders, for example, to make reports. However, if a hazard is identified, including a psychosocial hazard, then that should be reported through the appropriate reporting process for that organisation, so that it can be followed up, it can be investigated, it can be addressed as well, and that would apply to anyone. I'd say in the case of mental health first aiders, some of what you're dealing with there may link more into the mental health at work as well. So some of the information that might be shared at times might be related to people's relationships or other factors that are external to work. And so there may be a level of confidentiality in terms of sharing those sorts of issues back through a reporting system, but certainly if there's a work-related psychosocial hazard or a concern around that's raised, then that does need to be reported through appropriately to the people in that organisation who can actually address it.
And I guess going along those lines as well, if you have concerns about someone's, like serious concerns about their health and their welfare because of what they've told you, then always it's a good idea to try and get them to help. So as a health practitioner, a medical professional who can provide that support and services to them if you have real serious concerns about their well-being and their health.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's about it today, and I just want to remind everyone the webinar has been recorded and will be available on the WorkSafe website at a future date. Thank you for sending all your questions through. It's been a really great conversation, and thank you for attending today.